My lake ranch was the one place where I could finally escape the noise of everyday life. The property stretched through thick pine forest and surrounded a beautiful private lake. What I didn't know was that someone had decided to turn my ranch into a real estate showroom. The main entrance had one simple purpose: keeping unauthorized people off my property. I had a private gate across the access road, and everyone who visited knew they needed my permission. That rule had never caused a problem until the HOA got involved. One afternoon, I noticed something strange near my property. There were cars lined up along the private access road, far more than I had expected. Then I realized they weren't visitors. They were realtors. There must have been dozens of them. They were walking around with clipboards, taking pictures and talking about the lake views. Nobody had asked me for permission to be there. Then I saw Melissa, the HOA president, standing in the middle of the group. She was pointing toward different parts of my ranch, as if she were giving a property tour. That's when I realized this was an accident. I walked toward the group and asked Melissa what was going on. She barely looked surprised to see me. Instead, she told me the HOA had arranged a private property preview. Melissa said the HOA believed the ranch could be marketed to potential buyers. I reminded her that I owned the ranch and had never authorized a showing. She simply told me I was making a big deal out of nothing. I turned toward the realtors and calmly explained that they were standing on private property without my permission. I asked them to return to their vehicles and leave the ranch. Some immediately looked uncomfortable. Melissa stepped between me and the group and told everyone to stay. She claimed the HOA had arranged the entire event and that I had no right to cancel it. I looked at her and told her one simple thing: this is my land. I didn't argue with her. I simply walked to the gate and closed it between my private ranch and the crowd. Then I reached for my phone and decided it was time to call the police. I stepped a few feet away from the gate and called the local police. I explained that a large group had entered my private ranch without permission. Meanwhile, Melissa continued arguing with the realtors behind the gate. Some of the realtors clearly realized they had walked into a situation they didn't understand. A few began returning to their vehicles. Others stayed behind, waiting to see what Melissa would do next. Melissa insisted that the HOA had every right to arrange a showing. She claimed the realtors were only there to evaluate the community's property potential, but none of that explained why they were standing on my private land without asking me. A few minutes later, I saw 2 police officers driving toward the ranch entrance. The crowd became noticeably quieter. Melissa walked toward them, ready to tell her version of the story first. Melissa immediately told the officers that the HOA had organized an authorized property tour. She claimed I was interfering with an official community activity. The officers listened without taking sides. When it was my turn, I showed the officers the property records. I explained that the ranch and the lake were privately owned and that I had never authorized a tour. I also pointed out that I had already asked everyone to leave. One officer looked at the private property sign and then at the lock gate. He asked Melissa whether she had actually received my permission to bring the group inside. For the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. One of the realtors stepped forward and admitted they had been told the HOA had permission to arrange the tour. They hadn't been told the property owner objected. That changed the entire situation. The officers made it clear that the realtors should leave the private property. They explained that any dispute over HOA authority needed to be handled through the proper legal process. One by one, the realtors started walking back to their vehicles. Within minutes, the huge crowd that had filled my driveway was disappearing. The realtors loaded into their cars and began driving away. Melissa was left standing near the gate with nothing but her HOA folder. The last few realtors finally climbed into their vehicles. The long line of cars slowly disappeared down the gravel road. My private ranch was finally becoming quiet again. Melissa turned toward me and blamed me for ruining the entire showing. She said I had embarrassed the HOA in front of all those realtors. I told her the HOA had embarrassed itself by bringing strangers onto private property. One of the officers reminded Melissa that the property owner had clearly asked everyone to leave. He told her that future access should be arranged through the appropriate channels. Melissa reluctantly nodded, but she was clearly not happy. Once the officers finished speaking with her, I secured the gate again. The heavy lock clicked into place. This time, there was no crowd behind it, just my private ranch. The officers thanked me for cooperating and returned to their patrol SUV. They told me that if the HOA wanted to challenge my property rights, they needed to use the proper legal process. Then they drove away. When the police vehicle disappeared, Melissa was left standing there alone. There were no realtors left to impress and no crowd to convince. She looked at my lock gate and finally walked back toward her own vehicle. After everyone left, I walked down toward the lake. The water was calm, the trees were quiet, and the ranch finally felt like mine again. That peaceful view reminded me exactly why I protected this place. That evening, I sat down and documented everything that had happened. I saved the property records, the police information, and the details of the unauthorized showing. I wanted a complete record in case the HOA tried something similar again. The next morning, I added a larger sign to the entrance. It clearly stated that the ranch was private and all visits required owner authorization. There was no ambiguity anymore. I never wanted a confrontation with the HOA. I simply wanted them to understand that owning a property means having the right to control who enters it. That day, I shut the gate, called the police, and took my privacy back. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from.